Joining me today is the creator of the Dilbert comic strip, author of the new book, Win Bigly, and a guy who seems to make some pretty spot-on predictions. Scott Adams, welcome back to the Rubin Report.
Thanks for having me.
Before we begin, I gotta tell you, I was looking at these blurbs on the back of this book. How did you get these people? William Shakespeare, Mark Twain, Alexander the Great, Abe Lincoln, and even the Scott Adams guy? I mean, how in the world did you pull this off?
I stick with dead people because they can't complain later. It's like not one of them has complained that I've misquoted him. You know, Mark Twain, he said nothing about his quote.
So when I saw this, I thought immediately, there must be an estate for some of these people that monitor these types of things. Do you even have to think about that? Does the editor or the publisher go, Scott, you can't, Twain, come on.
Well, luckily my job is parody, and so I know those laws pretty well.
Yeah.
And as long as it's obvious parody, you can do anything you want.
Yeah, so we checked right before you walked in. We had you on the show September 1st of 2016, about 2 months before the election. And when I had you on, you were one of the only people that I thought basically was making sense of what was going on with Trump. At the time, you didn't say you were a Trump supporter. I think you actually said you were not a Trump supporter. You had sort of said the thing about you were in a hostage situation with Hillary, but basically you were saying, here's what Trump is doing. I don't necessarily support it. I think by the election time, you officially did support him, right?
Yeah, because of one issue, basically. When Clinton came out with the estate tax plan, and I realized that I personally would pay roughly 75 cents on every dollar I would earn for the rest of my life, which would basically make me retire.
Yeah.
I wouldn't possibly work for that. So that changed my mind.
Yeah, I wasn't going to jump into the estate tax, but I do find it one of the interesting things. I don't stand to make a windfall from the estate tax, but I find it one of those things where it's like, this money has been taxed for someone's entire life. Your money that you earn through all your hard work has been taxed your whole life. Hopefully you've made good investments and whatever else you've done. And then at the end, the government just says, okay, we're going to just basically take more than half of it at that point, after we've already taken it the whole time.
The whole tax thing, there's no way to make it fair, because there's always somebody who's going to complain. But some things just feel less fair. And that feels more like confiscation than tax.
Yeah, but I guess it's easy to be one of those people that just are like, well, I'm not involved in this. I don't stand to win anything of it, so why wouldn't I want to take the money from other people, right?
Right. Yeah. That's the big problem with the democratic system. People can vote other people's money into their pocket if there are enough of them voting.
Yeah. All right. So it's a little over a year ago that we had you on. You're making some sense of the techniques that you're writing about in this book, about persuasion and what Trump is doing and all that. Around that time, just like 2 months before the election, did you really think it was real?
I did really believe that he was going to win those weeks that we're talking about, and most of the time up to then. The only time my confidence was really shaken was the same time everybody else was. After the Access Hollywood Pussygate thing dropped. I don't think anybody thought that day that he could get out of that. I haven't heard of one person who said, yeah, that didn't bother me at all. But it was just amazing. There was so much news that whole cycle, and so much more came after that even something that large didn't have the impact it would have had, because it got lost in the enormity of it all.
Yeah, what does that tell you generally about truth right now? Now, the subtitle of your book is Persuasion in a World Where Facts Don't Matter. Facts and truth have a little something to do with each other. Yeah. What does that actually tell you, that something like that could happen, regardless of whether you think it was just something he said or locker room talk or all that nonsense, but that things don't stick in a way they used to? Let
me give some context for people who are new to me.
Yeah.
In addition to cartooning and writing and stuff, I'm a trained hypnotist, and I've been studying persuasion in all its forms for decades. So I was looking at it through that filter, and one of the things that hypnotists learn is that people are irrational pretty much all the time, and they just rationalize their decisions and believe that it made sense all along. And that's the normal way of things. Until you get in that mindset, the whole world looks confusing. You can't understand why you gave your good reasons and your facts and your logic, and the person you're talking to didn't change their mind. So my view on the election was that, certainly by the time that the Access Hollywood tape dropped, probably almost every mind was made up. They didn't know why, but they had made up their minds for emotional, irrational, whatever reasons. So it's tough to dislodge somebody. You know, he would have had to murder somebody in public to change minds at that point, that late stage, because people were really hardened in their opinions by then.
Yeah, what does that tell you? I mean, as we're taping this, this will be up next week, so a little right before Thanksgiving. We're taping this on today's the 8th? Is today the 8th? Does that sound right? Okay, that sounds, you're good, you're a pro. What does that tell you as I'm watching all these people on Twitter in the last day or so with this thank you Hillary hashtag and all this stuff and this continued worship of her, even though by every estimation she probably was the worst candidate in the history of American politics. That might be a bit of an overblown statement, but what does that tell you, that they're still on this? They're still on this thing that crumbled.
But consider that statement. We consider it now a given that she was one of the worst candidates we've ever seen. Prior to the election, and really maybe right up until Election Day, the general thought on both sides was, this is one of the strongest candidates we've ever seen, for everything from funding to experience to it was time for a woman. People were, you know, emotionally and every other way, the world was ready for that. So it's only after the fact that we've now reinterpreted what we saw as, wow, she was the worst candidate ever. And I don't know if either one of those is true. I think we had two candidates who had some real big pluses. She had lots of pluses and some real big flaws in both cases.
Yeah. Do you think that basically Trump, from before the election, so during the process until now, after a year of governing basically, or 10 months or so of governing, has basically used this book? I know he didn't have it, but you know what I mean? Like, is this really what he has done from beat one that you saw before a lot of people did?
So you have to understand his entire life arc. It starts with going to a church where his pastor was Norman Vincent Peale, the famous author who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. And so that's the first place he probably learned persuasion, at least one corner of persuasion, because in his time, Norman Vincent Peale was actually accused of being a hypnotist. He was that influential. So that optimism, you see him using it all the time to make us think into the future. When he talks about the GDP, he doesn't say, well, we got 3%, that's pretty good. That's what a normal president would say. He says, we got 3%, but without the hurricanes, I think it would have been 4. We probably got 4%. I think we'll do better than that. He's actually talking us into the future. And if you consider how an economy works, unless you have shortages of stuff, and we're really, you know, in a great time because we don't have shortages of anything, it's psychology that drives it. So if people think we're heading to 4%, they're going to invest a little bit more this year to get ready for that, and that's what makes it 4%. He's actually taking what he learned as a child and, you know, that persuasive thinking into the future and driving the economy that way. And then if you look at his full range of, he knows how to sell, marketing, branding, nobody doubts any of those skills at this point. And then negotiating. He wrote, literally, you know, authored with a co-author a book on negotiating. So he's seen persuasion from every angle, including design. You know, he's the one who, I believe, came up with, or at least approved, the hats and Make America Great Again. And I think people will look back at this for years and say that was the best branding we've ever seen.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because you said the positive way he speaks, and then you gave some examples. But if you listen to just the general narrative out there, this is the most divisive president of all the time. He says all these horrible things. What do you make of that portion of him? The Twitter portion that's fighting with people still all the time, doing things that, in my opinion, are below the office of the presidency. And I say that as someone that I really did. The reason I wasn't surprised when Trump won was because I actually sat down with you right before and I listened and I started seeing this stuff. So I wasn't thoroughly, I was on Joe Rogan the day before the election, or maybe it was election day actually. And I was like, yeah, I think it's possible. And
did I actually change your mind on that?
Well, I don't know that you fully changed my mind, but you made me aware of what was happening. I think basically before I sat down with you, I was sort of where I think a lot of people still are, which is they're just grabbing for anything. You know what I mean? Like they have nothing that they're really basing any decisions on. They see the tweets, they scream about the tweets, or they don't even have a chance to scream about the tweets because the media gets outraged before they can even process it. And you sort of framed it in a way that basically said to me, there's something sensible about this.
Yeah,
and I think most people have kind of missed that.
one of the things that is deeply important for persuasion is first you have to get people's attention. That's like, phase one. At this point, can anybody argue that he's the best we've ever seen at getting attention? Right? That's
I think that one, even his biggest haters
right.
would say, yeah, like the way he has dominated the media in every conversation, yes.
So step one, get attention. And the way he does that is he operates in what I call a narrow band of wrongness, meaning that if this is appropriate behavior, he just takes it up to this band, with the nicknames and the provocative things he says, but he never goes up here where you'd get impeached, you'd be put in the insane asylum and start a nuclear war. If you look how long he's been doing this, and how consistently he stays in that narrow band of wrongness, which is persuasion perfection, because you can't look away, and then you're thinking about what he wants you to think about. Now consider also that he's also been meeting with a lot of world leaders at this point. He doesn't do that in that context. So it's clear that he can modify his behavior to get the effect he needs. We didn't know that for sure. I'll say other people didn't know that for sure, when he was running. It looked a little crazy and maybe out of control, but now we've seen the fine control he puts on it. On Twitter, that narrow band of wrongness every time. In real life, he can modulate.
Everything being equal, as a smart guy and a bright guy and an author and someone that cares about words and all of those things, putting Trump aside for a moment, would you prefer that we just had a president that was a little more within the common standards of decency, or seemed to really appreciate, I keep telling the story that I was in D.C. a couple weeks ago and I went to all the monuments, I was reading all the great things that Jefferson wrote and George Washington, I'm like, it's very different than when they look back and they put Trump's tweets next to all of it.
Well, I have mixed feelings. For one, one of the things that the people on the left, let's say the anti-Trumpers, whoever they are, don't get is how entertaining he is to his base. The people who actually like what he's got to offer find it amazingly entertaining and funny. So the things that people are saying, oh, I can't believe he said that, he's an affront to all civilization, that's why it's funny. It's funny because we know he does it intentionally. We know the effect it'll have on a certain group of people. And that's sort of the joke, that it has that effect. Now, to answer your question, we were never offered somebody who had his talents and his specific policies that appealed to a lot of people who voted for him without the flaws. Nobody offered the Trump without the tweets that make people angry. And I would argue that probably 80% of the things that feel like they're over the line actually are functional. And the 20% that maybe...
Functional, how do you mean functional?
Gets attention. Puts a nickname on somebody that actually takes them completely out of the primaries. We saw that with low energy Jeb, and I think the crooked Hillary thing was quite effective. But there are other things that are maybe just too far. They don't have, they're not so far he gets impeached, but they're not useful. But they also don't seem to hurt him in the long run. We've seen something we may never see again, which is a complete disconnect between approval ratings, which are terrible, and people's image of what the economy is doing. For example, business confidence is great.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll ever see those disconnect again, and it's because of his style.
Does that also show you that people just don't care about polls anymore? I mean, I saw a poll on Sunday on CNN and it said, half of Americans don't trust Trump. And I thought, well, half Americans don't trust CNN. I mean, that all of the, you know what I mean? It's like you guys threw all these numbers at us before, you threw all this nonsense at us before, and now you're still throwing nonsense. And I really almost trust none of it, and it makes it harder to siphon some truth out. Yeah. But now the onus is on us.
I was just seeing a poll that was saying that something about what people think the leaders think of the president, and I'm thinking, how do we know what leaders of other countries think of the president? What good is that poll?
Right.
So yeah, we're a little bit
why is that
overpolled.
even relevant in an odd way, So if they fear us, certain countries, we want them to fear us, so they probably won't like the president, whether it was Trump or Obama or anyone else.
Well, I had been saying from the beginning, one of the big things that scared people about a President Trump was that how are other leaders going to deal with this guy? Are they going to be frightened? Will they make, the nuke us just in case? No problem so far. It turns out that if you're the President of the United States and you have good table manners when you talk to other leaders, there's nothing that they would rather do than deal with you, because
Yeah.
it's in their best interest and it works.
So I listened to you on Sam Harris's podcast, and Sam has obviously been here a bunch of times. I find him to be one of the brightest and most thoughtful people that I know. You guys obviously differ greatly on the Trump thing, probably more than anything else. But when you hear him make a couple of those arguments, whichever one, you can pick any one, does any of it get to you? Does any of it, the moral center, just what's really going on? If things really escalated with North Korea, you can pick one out of the bag.
Well, for those who didn't hear my conversation with Sam on his podcast, I was not addressing the moral, ethical dimension because I figured people are on their own for that. In other words, my moral center is not much different than everybody else's. I have exactly the same preferences. If you could do things without lying, without insulting people, of course I prefer that. But nobody gave us that choice. We didn't get that candidate. We had only the choices that we had. So I think there's an illusion that Sam and I disagreed on the ethical, moral stuff. I simply take the position.
Fair, yeah, right, because it really wasn't addressed specifically.
It wasn't directly asked, I don't think. I take the position that if a terrorist was holding your child, and the only way I could save him is lying to the terrorist, I will lie to the terrorist to save your child. Now, if you wouldn't, I'm not sure that you can claim a moral high ground. There are some situations, such as beating ISIS, having a good economy. These are fantastically good things for human beings. If the only way you could get there is bend some truths, then I'm a little bit more flexible about that. But I don't think my moral look on this is any different than anybody else's.
Yeah, but what about just the concerns that Sam and others, like the people that are the real critics of, forget, we can put Sam aside because if people haven't listened to it, it's not important. But when you hear people say, well, Trump is so erratic and he's dealing with an erratic leader in North Korea and all of those things, you basically think that that's all just playing that other higher bar this way, and that in reality we're still doing that.
Well, we could talk about North Korea separately because that's really kind of there's nothing like that. That's sort of its own situation. And at the moment, I think he's handling that right. Well, let's talk about that.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. What do you think about North Korea?
So for however many decades, we haven't really had any progress because they promise things and then they don't do them. This is probably the first time that Little Rocket Man, shall we call him, is literally worried that he'll be dead in the next 30 days. I don't think they've ever had that thought before, and that's got to help in the negotiations. Now, if you're thinking, but that might make him, fire off a nuke, well, that's the only way you could be sure you're dead. So right now, his only two choices are dead for sure, and I don't think he wants to pick that, or worrying about being dead unless he comes to the negotiating table, and there seems to be maybe a little bit of a hint of a movement there.
Yeah.
So, but to your bigger question, what about all the other stuff that is problematic? If you were to list all the things that people consider the criticisms of Trump on one column, and then all the things that people, even as critics, would say, okay, these things are going well, you would find that the things that are going well are generally real, meaning that there is less ISIS, stocks are up. He did appoint justices that at least his side likes. Immigration is down by 50%. These are real and measurable things, and they matter, and they're big. If you look at the list of things that people are criticizing, it's, well, we think he might cause a problem. Mm-hmm. We think this could go wrong. We're concerned that people think about him this way. We think that his supporters are, more racist than they are. Almost all of them would be legitimately classified as imaginary. Now, that's not to say that there couldn't be bad things in the future, but at the moment, they are purely imagined.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was on Sam's AMA podcast and we discussed this, and I mentioned, or he brought up the interview with you, but that's what I said too, basically. I said, look, I didn't even vote for the guy. I brought on the week before the election, I had Hillary Rosen, who's a progressive operative, basically, to come on and talk about why not to vote for him, but then I had people like you and others on and tried to talk to everybody about it. But I basically said that to Sam, which is, the things that he's actually been able to do are basically mainstream Republican things that if any other Republican would have done. The things that he hasn't been able to do actually show the strength of our system, because if you don't like his health care plan or the tax plan or whatever else, Congress is fighting him, and that's the way the government's supposed to work. And the other things, the tweets and all the other stuff, it's like, well, that's just nothing. It's just stuff. You know?
Take healthcare. So if you were going to make a criticism about the president's performance, healthcare would be at the top of the list of criticisms. And this illustrates what I call the two movies on one screen. We're all looking at the same set of facts, and we're producing completely different movies in our minds about what's happening. So some people would say, well, he hasn't solved healthcare. That's a failure. But my observation is, what was the deadline for that? Is there a time you're supposed to be done and that passed? Because I don't see the deadline. What I see is somebody who let the Republicans go first, fail hard because they were going to. They didn't have a plan that was going to be popular. Scare the left while letting the right fail as hard as they can. And then what's he do? He says, well, maybe I'll talk to the Democrats. Until he gets both of them in this situation, setting the table, he calls it. He actually has a word for this, right? This is not accidental. You know, if your brand is negotiating and you do things that any objective person who understands negotiating recognizes as correct technique, he's softening up both sides, and it's going to take a while. It might take Obamacare to fail a little harder. It might take the public to see their costs going up in Obamacare. That's not a good thing. But it might be the only way you can get these two sides that are on such opposites somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
So as he failed, I would say it's a process, and it's probably the only way it could go.
How much are you concerned at all that the people around him, this is one of the things I hear a lot, that the people around him, that for either certain things aren't staffed right now. I don't have that much of a problem with that, because I think the government should be a lot smaller as a general rule. But putting that aside, that people say that, well, the intellectual acumen around him isn't that great. Like, you've got these players around him, these people that understand a lot of the things you're talking about, but not sort of like a serious group of like intellects around him.
In what department? You know, does he really need help in the State Department? Because the international stuff looks like it's going pretty well. Does he need help in the economics? Seems like it's going really well. Does he need more help than General Mattis to beat ISIS? Mattis is doing great. Now, if you get down to, you know, the Department of Agriculture and, you know, the EPA and stuff, those are real arguments you can have about whether you've got the right horsepower there. And I would listen to those arguments for sure. But in terms of how much is staffed and whether there's enough staff, I'm still waiting for that to matter.
Well, it sort of goes to that other point of just the other things. There's some literal things that have happened and some maybes and could issues. Do you ever feel like you're stuck sort of acting as his counsel publicly or something? I suddenly felt like I was like really grilling you on Trump, and it was in an odd way, because we're obviously going to talk about your book too, but it's all intertwined.
You know, it's funny, in my mind, it's always about persuasion and about a more effective way to see the world that does a better job of predicting. You know, I guess it's now a year and a half ago, I said that he would do more than change politics. And boy, has he changed politics. But I said he would rip a hole in our reality to let us look through and see something completely different. And he's done that because didn't you used to think that facts mattered? And didn't you think that if somebody said as many things as he said, that the fact checker said, oh no, that doesn't work? That you couldn't possibly become president, and if you did, you couldn't possibly have a good economy, beat ISIS, and all the other things he's doing. None of it was true. And if you were a trained persuader, you could see that early. You could see that none of that would matter, because you could see that his persuasive skill was that strong. Now, I have to jump in and just say one point.
Yeah.
Facts do matter to outcomes, and all things being equal, we would love to get the accurate facts. But usually when he's non-factual, he's persuading in the direction that we would like. So if he says the number of deaths by gun in Chicago are 1,000 per day, but it's really 10 per day, we still need to fix that problem, and he made us focus on it. The fact that it wasn't accurate, did it matter? It didn't. Now, And I think he knows it, and I think it's conscious, and he calls it hyperbole. He has a name for it.
Yeah. Well, that was going to be my follow-up question. Do you think he's really conscious of all of this stuff? I guess I would feel better if I really thought he was conscious of all. If I knew he was conscious of all of it, I guess I would feel better.
He's conscious.
And yet at the same time, that would mean he intentionally, these are lies. I mean, if he knows them and he's intentionally doing it, even if it's for all the reasons that you lay out here in the book, that's still, then it's an outright lie as opposed to just an exaggeration or hyperbole.
Well, I would say that you have to consider intention. At this point, I don't see any scenario in which the good of the country and how he does personally are separated. Right? He has to do a good job for the country. So if he's telling a lie that's good for him and bad for the country, that's just a frickin' lie. Right? Nobody's in favor of that. But if he says, hey, we've got to fight extra hard to fix this problem that everybody wants fixed, and there's a little bit of an exaggeration in that, well, it's still the direction we do want to go. So those situations, you can call it a lie, you can call it someone who didn't pass the fact checking. He would call it hyperbole because it's a sort of an exaggerated truth, if you will. In other words, directionally it's true. Just the details are wrong.
So as a guy that has written one of the most popular comic strips of all time, the whole purpose, I mean, I think of comic strips and of stand-up and everything else is that you're getting to a kernel of truth at the end of that thing, right? Like every time I assume, is that fair to say that every time you ever wrote a strip that there's a kernel of truth at the end, right? Like
if you do it right, yes.
If you do it right.
Right.
So how can you also be the guy that's saying that it's okay to live in a facts don't matter place? Like facts and truth, there's some rope there, right?
I love that you asked that question because this is just a perfect way to make the point. The comic strip is an exaggerated world. It's just a crazy, something that wouldn't actually happen in the real world. But what people say about it is, that is just like my job. So they're looking at something that's this crazy world, and they're still seeing the truth. And so if you're a good cartoonist, you've made both of those things happen. They shouldn't be together, And so that's a perfect example that I get to see every day, where people say, that's just like my office. And I say, no, there were no aliens in your office. Somebody's head exploded. That didn't happen in your office. So stuff in the comics people regard as feeling real when they clearly are not.
That's interesting. Are you familiar with the term kayfabe? It's the term that wrestlers use. That that's the fakery. That everyone knows it's fake. We all know it's fake. And yet you're eliciting real emotions from people that go there and pay you to do something fake and have a real emotion. And I think there is some connection with that and what you're talking about. And that Trump was kind of, he was a fan of wrestling. There's those clips of him, I think, at WrestleMania and taking out Vince McMahon and the rest of it. Yeah, so he is playing that game.
He has merged theater and politics like nobody's ever done. And he just happens to be good at the theater stuff. And so he effectively merged them. I don't think we'll ever see this again. This is a very special situation. And he has, I've probably said this before, but he has a talent stack of individual talents that he's a B+, A- at, but there's so many of them, and they work so well together. All of his persuasion stuff, his theater stuff, his public speaking, his intelligence, they're all high, but you'd say to yourself, wow, we've had smarter presidents, we've had better orators, people who speak better than I do.
Either one, one way or another.
We've definitely had those.
Yeah.
But very few people have had that combination with business experience, with his ability to take criticism, even though people say he's thin-skinned. You don't get into this game unless you know you can handle the criticism.